War is an algorithm. We will show its price. A child born in Ukraine in 2022 will inherit a national debt of $184.8 billion. That child did not vote for war. That child did not borrow a single dollar. But by 2025, Ukraine's public debt has nearly doubled, from $95.4 billion before the invasion to $184.8 billion by mid-2025. The debt-to-GDP ratio stands at 97%. In 2025 alone, Ukraine will spend $11.5 billion on debt interest payments, more than it spends on pensions and social programs combined. This is not a temporary cost. This is a generational transfer. The bill for war is not paid when the fighting stops. It is paid for decades afterward, by people who had no say in the decision to fight. We are going to calculate exactly how that mechanism works, and who ends up holding the check. The mechanics of war debt. War spending follows a predictable pattern. Governments borrow to fund operations because they cannot raise enough revenue through taxation during a conflict. Tax bases shrink as economies contract. Businesses shut down. Workers stop working. Revenue disappears. The deficit widens. The government borrows more. The debt grows. This is not unique to any single conflict. It is the universal fiscal architecture of modern warfare. The United States borrowed to fight Iraq and Afghanistan. Iraq borrowed to fund the Iran-Iraq War. Ukraine borrows to survive the current conflict. The mechanism is identical across every case. Only the scale and the duration differ. But here is the part that rarely gets measured: the interest. War debt does not just consume the principal. It consumes future revenue through interest payments that compound over decades. A dollar borrowed today at 7% becomes 1.97 in 10 years and 3.87 in 20. Every dollar spent on interest is a dollar not spent on education, infrastructure, healthcare, or economic development. The debt does not just cost money, it crowds out the future. Iraq, the $130 billion inheritance. Iraq is the historical case study for generational debt transfer. Before the Iran-Iraq War began in 1980, Iraq was a net creditor nation with substantial oil revenues. By the end of that war in 1988, Iraq's external debt stood at $86 billion. The debt-to-GDP ratio reached 278%. Debt service consumed more than half of Iraq's oil revenues. They said, oil revenues will cover Iraq's reconstruction costs. They got a country so indebted that it invaded Kuwait in 1990, partly to access Kuwaiti oil fields and cancel Kuwait's share of Iraqi debt. The invasion triggered the Gulf War, which added another layer of destruction and international sanctions that lasted until 2003. By the time the US-led coalition invaded in 2003, Iraq's external debt was estimated at between $60 billion and $130 billion. GDP had collapsed from $128 billion in 1979 to roughly $40 billion in 2001. The country's rank on the UN Human Development Index had fallen from 76th in 1990 to 127th in 2001. The reconstruction costs that followed were staggering. Estimates placed the total at up to $230 billion. The United States spent $61 billion on Iraqi reconstruction, much of which was documented as inefficiently spent or lost, according to the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction. Iraq's debt-to-GDP ratio in 2024 stands at 46.46%, and the IMF forecasts it will rise to 74% by 2029. The generational burden continues. The U.S. debt paradox. The Iraq and Afghanistan wars produced a debt mechanism that is unprecedented in American history. For the first time, the United States financed wars entirely through borrowing while simultaneously cutting taxes. The wars added an estimated $1.3 trillion to the national debt between 2001 and 2012, raising the public debt to GDP ratio by 9 to 10 percentage points. But the largest cost has not yet been paid. The single biggest accrued liability of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars is veterans' medical care and disability benefits. These costs come due decades after combat. The peak year for paying disability compensation to World War I veterans was 1969, more than 50 years after the war ended. The largest expenditures for World War II veterans arrived in the late 1980s. The total interest on the post-9/11 war debt could reach $7 trillion over time, according to research from Harvard's Kennedy School, dwarfing all other war-related costs combined. This is debt that will be serviced by taxpayers who were not born when the wars began. It is a generational transfer, measured not in the billions spent on bombs and bullets, but in the trillions that will be paid in interest on the borrowing that funded them. Ukraine, the debt clock. Ukraine's debt trajectory is the sharpest example of how quickly war debt accumulates in a modern conflict. Before the full-scale invasion in February 2022, Ukraine's debt-to-GDP ratio stood at 49%. Public debt totaled $95.4 billion. Annual budget deficits were manageable, covered by modest IMF tranches of $1 to $2 billion. By the end of 2024, that ratio had nearly doubled to 90.4%. Public debt reached $166.1 billion. The annual budget deficit, excluding grants, hit 20% of GDP. Military spending absorbs 60% of the total state budget. Ukraine allocates all of its tax revenues to its military. Everything else, pensions, wages, humanitarian aid, is funded by external borrowing. In 2024, Ukraine received $5.4 billion in IMF loans alone, but the terms have shifted. Pre-war IMF lending to Ukraine carried interest rates of 2 to 3%. The current IMF credit bears interest of approximately 8.5%. Ukraine is replacing cheaper old debt with more expensive new debt, not because it chose to, but because wartime risk premiums make borrowing expensive. By mid-2025, national debt reached $184.8 billion. The debt-to-GDP ratio hit 97%. Debt interest payments in 2025 total $11.5 billion. That figure exceeds the combined budget for pensions and social programs, $10 to $16 billion. The IMF has assessed Ukraine's debt as unsustainable absent full implementation of its debt restructuring strategy. Ukraine completed a restructuring of $20.5 billion in Eurobonds in 2024, achieving a 35.75% haircut. But restructuring only addresses commercial debt. The bulk of Ukraine's borrowing consists of government-to-government loans from the EU, World Bank, and IMF, instruments that cannot be restructured through conventional means. The GDP warrant trap. Ukraine carries a particularly insidious form of debt instrument, GDP-linked securities issued in 2015, valid until 2041. These instruments require Ukraine to make payments to creditors whenever the economy grows faster than 3% of GDP. The faster the recovery, the larger the payment. Under post-war reconstruction conditions, when growth rates could reach 5 to 14% annually, payments on these instruments could reach $1 to $2 billion per year. This is, in economic terms, a tax on recovery. The mechanism penalizes success. Every percentage point of GDP growth above the threshold triggers a mandatory wealth transfer to bondholders. This is the debt structure that Ukraine's future generations will inherit. Not just the principal, not just the interest, but a system that redirects economic growth toward creditor payments before it can be reinvested in the country. The generational math. The pattern is consistent across every case. Iraq accumulated $86 billion in debt during the Iran-Iraq War and has not fully recovered 40 years later. The United States added $1.3 trillion in war debt between 2001 and 2012, with interest costs projected to reach $7 trillion over decades. Ukraine doubled its debt-to-GDP ratio in 3 years and now spends more on debt service than on social programs. In every case, the decision to borrow was made by one generation. The cost is paid by another. The people who authorize the spending are gone. The people who pay the interest had no voice in the decision. This is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. War is financed through debt because the alternative, funding it through current revenue, would require the immediate, visible imposition of costs on the population. Debt defers those costs. It makes them invisible. It spreads them across decades and across generations who cannot object. War does not just consume the present, it mortgages the future. And the interest on that mortgage compounds long after the last shot is fired. Subscribe to What War Costs. The debt that war leaves behind is always larger than the war itself.